It's just about how we listen and pay attention to stories that are captivating in our culture. And there's a reason those stories are captivating. The most captivating, the most true story of all is the story of Jesus, the gospel. And these captivating stories in our culture, they can point to Jesus if we listen to them, pay attention well. All truth is God's truth. Sometimes it shows up in all sorts of different places. And so we like to have a little fun, be creative. And so we've been talking about the gospel according to Inside Out because as it is, stories show up in movies in our culture and people get captivated by those. Today, we're going to talk about the gospel according to Star Wars. So, I know going into this that I'm going to be preaching to some Star Wars super fans, some Star Wars nerds. If you're sitting by a Star Wars nerd, you might want to move right now. Just get away from them. Just if you don't like Star Wars, if you don't know anything about Star Wars, I want to tell you it's going to be okay. We're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about the gospel. So as long as you like that, I got something for you today. So, Star Wars is, I didn't look up the stats, but I'm sure it's a record-breaking movie series and super, super popular. And if you are, my age, even younger than me, older than me for sure, when you got introduced to Star Wars, you got introduced in the 70s and 80s, a series of movies came out, and they introduced us to the story of Star Wars. And, of course, it was the story of Luke Skywalker, the young hero protagonist, and confronting the dark forces of an evil empire. And there was a particular villain. I mean, this is the villain's villain. And we get introduced in the early moments of Star Wars to this evil bad guy. How many of you know who I'm talking about? And I mean, he's got the best bad guy name. He's got the best bad guy look. He's just the best bad guy. His name is Darth Vader. I want to give him props just for coming up with that name, So we got a picture of Darth Vader for you. You remember, you get introduced to Darth Vader. He is so evil, he breathes funny. He can't even breathe normal. Darth Vader's coming down the hallway because of his breathing. He has a James Earl Jones voice, the best voice ever, and he's Darth Vader. So we get introduced to Darth Vader in the early movies of Star Wars, and we just size him up quickly, and we know Darth Vader looks like that. He breathes funny. He talks funny. He's a bad guy. He's evil. He's an enemy, and we start hoping somebody kills Darth Vader. That's how the movie works. That's how the story works. One of the brilliant things about Star Wars and the way the story is told is that it brings us into the story in the middle of the story. And so when we watch the first few movies, we don't know it, but we're watching the middle 3 movies. And the story's been going on for a long time before we got there. So we just meet Darth Vader in his kind of middle age, career of being a bad guy. And that's all we think he is he's just a bad guy. And it's easy to label him. It's easy to write him off. It's easy to just say, I don't like that guy. I hope somebody slices his head off with a lightsaber. You watch the 3 movies and they unfold. When you get rewound in the story writers do something really interesting, and they take us back in Darth Vader's life. And they take us earlier into the story, and they introduce us to Darth Vader before he's Darth Vader. Darth Vader before he becomes evil. Darth Vader, the young boy. Darth Vader, the child. Darth Vader, the young man. He has a name. His name isn't Darth Vader. His name is Anakin Skywalker. And so look what Anakin looks like. I mean, he kind of looks like he could turn evil, but he's a good-looking guy. He's got a blue lightsaber. He's just a strapping young fellow. The story tells us that Anakin growing up has a promise. He has a prophecy over his life. He has a calling and a good purpose to do good things, to overthrow evil and be good. And so the story forces us to listen to the story of someone we thought was an enemy. And that personalizes the enemy for us. So how many of you know that evil people don't go to bed on Tuesday night, lay down, a nice-looking 22-year-old guy, lays down, goes to bed on Tuesday night, wakes up on Wednesday morning, put a dark mask on, and start killing people because they're bad. No, Star Wars story is telling us that these progressions and deformation, it takes place gradually over a long period of time in our life. And that people who start off good, if they give themselves over to dark forces and they make bad choices, they can become deformed. They can become false versions of themselves. And so, as the story unfolds, Anakin Skywalker is a young man, and he's growing up. He's got a lot of great people in his life. He's got great voices. He's got Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's got Yoda. Yoda is the greatest character of all time. He's the GOAT. I mean, a little green guy sitting Indian style, just whipping bad guys. He talks backwards. You gotta love Yoda. Yoda gives Anakin some advice as Anakin is beginning to be tempted to move to the dark side. And here's what Yoda says. We're going to hear the gospel according to Yoda for a minute this morning. We'll have to make sure it's gospel, but we're going to listen to it. You ready? He says, the fear of loss is a path to the dark side. He sees something happening in Anakin's life where Anakin is traumatized. He wants to protect the people that he loves from evil. And so in order to do that, he starts embracing vengeful, violent attitudes because he wants to control and protect. So he starts out with good motives, but Yoda notices, Anakin, you're becoming something you're not intended to be. And the fear of loss can be a path to the dark side. How many of you know that you can be so fearful of losing something that you adopt evil means to protect and keep it? Ooh, wish I could preach that for a little while. And so Yoda tells him fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering. Wow. I'm going to say amen to Pastor Yoda on that one right there. You see, oftentimes we don't associate fear and anger. We've been talking about inside out, but I'll tell you this, there's a lot of hateful people in society right now. There's a lot of hateful people on social media right now. There's a lot of people that are enraged and angry and hateful, and if you show me a hateful person, I'll show you a fearful person. Because behind hate, fear is always lurking. People hate other people because they're afraid, and it's usually based on a lie that they believed about other people. And so one of the things that Star Wars, the story, forces us to do is to slow down and say, I could easily label Darth Vader. I could write him off. I could say he's just a bad guy. But if I listen to his story, I'm going to have a different perspective on who I think he is. And so Star Wars teaches us this, that an enemy, and watch this, an enemy is someone whose story you haven't heard. And I promise you, if you find your enemies, Oh, I'm going to preach for a little while this morning. If you find your enemies and you listen to their story, you may not agree with them, but you will begin to understand them. The psalmist said, one of the things that the Lord, my shepherd, does is he prepares a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Why would God prepare a table in the presence of my enemies? Well, I'd suggest to you that one possible reason might be that God knows one way to turn enemies into something other than an enemy is to get them to sit down at the table with me. So God might want to defeat your enemies, but he may not defeat them with a hammer or a sword. He might want to defeat them with a table. So that when you set a table for people who have set themselves against you, and you say, I'm going to spread a table for you, and I want to hear a little bit more about your story, all of a sudden the things that ramp us up in hate and rage begin to be dialed down because we're listening to someone's story. I would even suggest to you that the kingdom of Jesus is a kingdom that is advanced through the setting of a table. When we come together and worship Jesus, we come to a table. We come to receive the table of the Lord. We come to receive the bread, which is his body, and we come to receive the cup, which is his blood, because the table overcomes enemies. Luke Skywalker, if you haven't watched Star Wars or never heard of it, there's going to be plenty of spoilers today. So if you haven't seen it, you're planning on watching it, just mute your device or plug your ears. Luke Skywalker is Darth Vader's son. Yeah, I know. I'm so sorry. Welcome to the world. And thank you for crawling out from under that rock. There are a few of us who remember the shock of finding out that Luke Skywalker is Darth Vader's son. And in the movie, Luke comes to find out that Darth Vader is his father, and he is used to call his father back from the dark side, to remind his father that you have not always been Darth Vader. That's not your true identity. That's a false identity that the emperor/enemy has given you, but your true identity is Anakin Skywalker. You're my father. And so there's a little short conversation we're going to watch with Luke and his father, Darth Vader. Let's watch.
The Emperor has been expecting you.
I know, Father.
So, you have accepted the truth.
I've accepted the truth that you were once Anakin Skywalker, my father.
That name no longer has any meaning for me.
It is the name of your true self you've only forgotten. I know there is good in you. The Emperor hasn't driven it from you fully.
It's the name of your true identity. I know there's still good in you. The Emperor hasn't driven it from you fully. How many of you have some family members or some friends who are making bad choices and moving into a false identity of the enemy's plan for their life? You can give them a message of hope, a message of faith to say, no, you have a true identity and there is still good in you. God is not finished with you yet. We sang it this morning. No matter how far you've gone, no matter how many bad choices you've made, no matter how much you're allowing darkness into your life, if you will turn to the light, there's still goodness in you. The enemy might have gotten his hands on you, but he hasn't fully driven the goodness out of you. In Jesus, there's always hope. And Jesus is in the business of encountering people lost in their false self and leading them to their true selves. That's what Jesus does. Jesus does this in the Gospels. So you want some scripture? You want some Bible? I'm here with it. John chapter 1, verse number 42, Andrew brings Simon, his brother, to Jesus. And it says he brought him to Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, but you shall be Cephas," which translated is Peter. Jesus says, "You are Simon, but you shall be Peter." I want to suggest to you that this is a pattern that everyone who encounters Jesus will see Jesus doing in their life. Jesus always meets you where you are. He identifies you as you are. He doesn't require you to change or get better or improve before he's willing to meet you, but Jesus never leaves you where you are. He always calls you to become who he says you can be. You are Simon, but I'm telling you, you can become Peter. And Jesus is doing this in your life. God is always meeting people where they are and telling them who they can be. You are Abram, but you shall be Abraham. You are Sarai, but you shall be Sarah. You are Jacob, but you shall be Israel. You are Simon, but you shall be Peter. An interesting thing happens in the Gospel of John, especially, and in all the Gospels, where we meet Simon, and he meets Jesus, and Jesus tells him, "You can become Peter." And then you can notice this in the Gospel of John in particular. All through the Gospel of John, Simon, Peter, takes this double name. Simon Peter did this. Simon Peter said this. Simon Peter interacted in this way. All through the Gospel, you just notice that. And I want you to have a little flag pop up every time you see that name, Simon Peter, because that is the text inviting you to identify yourself. Who is Simon Peter? Simon Peter is a guy who met Jesus, heard from Jesus, he could become Peter, and he's following Jesus, but sometimes he's Simon and sometimes he's Peter. He's a little bit of Simon and a little bit of Peter, but he's following Jesus. I love Simon Peter because he's always sticking his foot in his mouth. He's always getting things wrong. He's always getting corrected by Jesus. He's always messing up and stumbling around because he's a message of hope to every follower of Jesus, that your life following Jesus is going to be a progression and a process of ceasing to be who you used to be and slowly becoming who Jesus said you can be. And so sometimes your really close friends, you might need to tell them every now and then, your Simon's coming out. Your Simon is showing. Because Jesus is always graciously at work in us. Here's the message of the gospel according to Star Wars. You can write this down. Jesus meets us in the darkness of our false self and invites us into the light of our true self. You say, well, and if you leave the gospel just to Star Wars or just to Disney, you might miss this. But there is no light of our true self without the light of the world. And so Peter's story shows us that we find the light of our true self when we find the light of Jesus. And so in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus and Peter have this conversation. This is the middle of the gospel. Remember, his name is Simon. He's called to be Peter. And Jesus, says to them, "But who do you say that I am?" This is Matthew chapter 16. Let's put that on the screen. Here it is. He said, "Who do you say that I am?" Here it is. Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, Jesus had never been called the Christ or identified before. And Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter. And upon this rock, I'll build my church. And the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now let me just explain to you what just happened right there. Simon got a revelation of who Jesus was. And when Simon got a revelation of who Jesus was, Jesus turns around and gives Simon a revelation of who Simon is really going to be. And he says, since you've identified me correctly as the light of the world, as the Christ, the Son of the living God, now that light is going to shine into you, and you are going to become Peter, and I'm going to build my church upon this rock. Now you say, what does that mean? That means that Jesus has always been and will always be building his church on the rock of a bunch of Simons who have found out they can become Peters. You see, Jesus is willing to build his church upon the rock of people who are being transformed by the light of who Jesus is. And so we as a church, the Bridge Church, is being built by Jesus on the rock of people who are experiencing the transforming power and grace of Jesus Christ. We are a bunch of Simons who heard from Jesus. We could be Peters. That doesn't mean we're perfect. We're actually a bunch of Simon Peters. Y'all doing okay? So I want to say this. The Bridge Church is going to be a church that makes space and has grace for people to be Simon Peter. The Bridge Church is going to be a church that has space and grace for people to say, I don't have it all together. I got 2 amens right there. 2. I counted them, 2. I should have gotten 200 right there. That was a good place to say amen. I'll try it again in a minute. I'm coming back to that. I mean, if you're a Peter and you got it all together, and all you do is point out everybody else is Simon, I got a list of churches I can share with you. Love to introduce you to them. We don't need a bunch of prideful Peters who point out everybody else's problems. We need a bunch of Simon Peters who are madly in love with Jesus in the midst of seeing their lives transformed into who Jesus said we can be. So Simon Peter says to Jesus, now you know Simon Peter's story, it's not very different than Anakin Skywalker's story because he took a few dark paths. So Peter is being transformed. He's Simon Peter. He's becoming Peter. He's following Jesus. But then Jesus gets crucified. And Peter's like, I'm out. I didn't sign up for this. I don't know what's going on. I'm confused. And he starts turning back to his old false identity. And so he looks at his disciples, he looks at his friends, and he tells them, I'm going fishing. Now that's not just like a camping trip or a holiday venture. That's Peter saying, I'm going back to doing what I was doing before I met Jesus. This disciple thing, this apostle thing, it ain't working out. I know how to be a fisherman. So he goes back to fishing. And then Jesus rises from the dead and starts looking for Peter. When Jesus rises from the dead in the Gospel of Mark, he finds some women and he tells the women what to do. And he says, I want you to go tell my disciples and Peter that you saw me and I rose from the dead. Peter is on Jesus' mind when he gets out of the tomb because Peter's the one who's veered off to the dark side. And he says, I want you to go tell my disciples and Peter. Then Peter's got all of his buddies out on the boat fishing. And Jesus shows up on the beach in John 21. They're trying to catch fish out of the water, and Jesus is cooking fish on the beach. Sometimes when you're trying hard to make things happen in your life, if you'll just get in the presence of Jesus, you'll find out everything I've been working so hard to try and make happen, Jesus can graciously provide me. And he says to them on the boat, friends, do you have any fish? This is like deja vu because this happened a long time earlier in the Gospels. And they're like, no, we fishing all day and we haven't caught nothing. And Jesus is like, I got some fish over here. And he says, throw your net on the other side. And he throw the net and they catch 153 fish. Someone counted them. I don't even know what went on there. 153 fish, bring them on. Jesus feeds them. And here's the conversation Jesus has with Peter, who has gone back to being Simon. You see, watch this. Even when we get lost and return to our false self, Jesus pursues us, finds us, calls us back to himself. In him, we find our true self. You see, Jesus isn't interested in giving you a lecture about all the wrong turns you took. Your mom might do that. Your dad might do that. Your grandma might do that. But Jesus isn't as interested in rehashing all your wrong turns as he is in getting you back to him. Because in his presence, you'll rediscover who you were called to be. So listen to this conversation Jesus has with Simon Peter. It says in John chapter 21, so when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, now watch what he does. He says, Simon. Now, Jesus hasn't been calling him Simon all through the Gospels because Jesus told him that's who you used to be. Jesus has been calling him Peter. We just read that. He said, I say to you, you're Peter. But now he finds Peter regressed into his old false identity and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, what is Jesus doing? Now, I want to tell you what we know Jesus is certainly not doing. Jesus is certainly not shaming Simon. He's not saying, oh my God, I can't believe you've gone backwards. You turned into Simon. No, here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, Simon, even when you choose to go the wrong direction, I'm going to come find you. I'm going to come identify you where you are, and grace is going to say, you know you're supposed to be Peter. I'm going to grab you by the hand as Simon and say, follow me again. So let's read the conversation. He says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my lambs, or feed my sheep. This is Peter's calling. John 21, verse number 19 says, now this he said, signifying what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, Jesus said to him, follow me. Now, what did he, just 4 verses earlier, he called him Simon. Then he says, yes, Lord, I love you. Jesus says, follow me. And the text says, Peter turning around. See, anytime you find yourself in a Simon season, Jesus is going to come looking for you. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and they're in a Simon season. They're naked, they're afraid, they got fig leaves, and God says, Adam, where are you? Lord, I was naked, and I was afraid, I was ashamed. Who told you you were naked? That's not your right identity. You're not supposed to be covered in shame and in this false self. He's looking for you, and Jesus is looking for Peter, and he says, Simon, where did you go? Where are you? I want to bring you back to myself. And you know what Jesus does when he finds you in a Simon season? He says, hey, remember, I asked you to follow me 3 years ago. And I'm going to ask you the same thing right now. If you still love me, just do a U-turn. And Peter, turning around, followed Jesus. You see, what we need in our lives are people who are good at representing Jesus to us. People who know how to find us in our Simon season. People who know how to show up when you're back in alcohol addiction, who know how to show up when you're back in generational cycles, who know how to show up when you're back in a dark season of your life. And they don't show up with a bunch of shame, they show up with a bunch of grace. They show up representing Jesus, who says, hey, come on, let's get back in the presence of Jesus, because in the presence of Jesus, anybody can make a U-turn. Anybody can turn around and follow Jesus. And so, Luke Skywalker is this Christ-like character who builds a relationship with his Father and helps his Father turn back to his true identity. But Luke does something else very Jesus-y. And it's the last thing I want to tell you this morning. And that is, in Jesus. And this is for somebody today. In Jesus, generational cycles can be broken and reversed. Amen. Amen. So you say, what does that look like? Well, Luke is, can you just imagine at the age of 18 or 20, you find out that your dad is the guy that breathes funny and kills everybody? Like that's really not that's not a blessing, right? My dad is the infamous villain of the universe. But Luke finds this out. But Luke realizes he has a choice to make. I can either let the evil cycles of the emperor's will, and the emperor is code for the enemy. It's code for the devil in Star Wars. And so I want to show you a clip of how Luke begins to break generational cycles. And before we run that clip, just got to set it up for you. So if you think Darth Vader is bad, you're going to get to meet his boss now. His boss is really ugly. He's really mean looking. If you were as ugly as his boss, you'd probably be a villain too. So it's understandable why the emperor is such a grumpy fellow. But he's got Luke in his throne room. Darth Vader's in the throne room. And the emperor is trying to persuade Luke that it's your destiny to follow the pattern of your father, and that you are going to serve me just like your father served me. So let's go into the emperor's throne room and see what happens.
From here, you will witness the final destruction of the Alliance and the end of your insignificant rebellion. You want this, don't you? The hate is swelling in you now. Take your Jedi weapon. Use it. I am unarmed. Strike me down with it. Give in to your anger. With each passing moment, you make yourself more my servant. No. It is unavoidable. It is your destiny. You, like your father, are now mine.
Oh. It is your destiny. You, like your father, are now mine. Now, if I had time, which I don't, I would love to preach to you about how the temptation works in Luke's life. So the temptation is to take his anger, his righteous anger, at an evil emperor. He's tempting him to take the lightsaber and strike me down. Because the emperor knows, even if you strike me down, you'll become evil in doing it. I am going to preach that. And so the way the enemy tempts us, is sometimes by doing good things in the wrong spirit. Because the enemy doesn't care if I win the battle as long as I become evil while I'm winning the battle. It's a greater victory because I become evil. So Luke resists the temptation to go into the dark side of hate and vengeance and anger, and he resists the temptation and he suffers because of it. But I'm gonna preach the gospel. Y'all Star Wars nerds, get ready. His co-suffering love from the emperor's wrath sets his father free. Woo. They didn't get that in the first service. I missed that. Luke's co-suffering love that suffers the wrathful vengeance of the emperor sets his father free, and Darth Vader picks the emperor up and throws him down the tunnel of doom. I don't even know what it is, but you know. I'm not a Star Wars nerd. He throws him down the electrical channel that blows him up. I don't know what happens. Spoiler alert. You say, what does that have to do with me? Well, Luke, like many of us, received some generational impurities, to say the least. You know, and everybody's got things that get passed down to them from generation to generation. So your family story is probably different, but this just kind of represents 2 generations beyond. And your grandfather went through some things. Somebody poured something into his vessel that was his life. And whatever he had, he poured out into your mother or your father, whichever side. And so this impure, we're talking about inside out the last 2 weeks, this emotional toxicity, this emotional impurity, this harm, this trauma, this bitterness, this disease we call sin. And, you know, it's easy for us sometimes to have an aggravated relationship with their parents. And I feel like somebody needs me to tell you this, that you may have received a bitter cup from your mom or your dad, but the truth is your mom or your dad, they just poured into you whatever was poured into them. Life poured things into them. Bad parents poured things into them. And so your mom and your dad, they come along, and Luke gets this poured into him, this generational cycle. And the enemy will draw attention just like the emperor and say, look at your generational history. Look at what your parents, they were addicted. How do you think you're not going to be addicted? It is your destiny. You, like your father, are now mine. This is the voice of the enemy in our life. But Luke finds another way, and you can find another way. Simon Peter found another way by placing himself in the light of Jesus. And when we place ourselves in the light of Jesus, he says, I'll come with pure living water, and I'll begin to wash you and cleanse you. And the psalmist said, your cup will begin to overflow. And Jesus says, I'll keep pouring grace out on you. I'll keep pouring goodness out on you. I'll keep pouring mercy out on you. And I want you to notice that this is a process. This is a process. And so a lot of times people start coming to church. They start following Jesus. And then they'll come to me and they'll say, Pastor Jay, you keep saying that I'm changing, but I don't feel that differently. And all I want to say to you is just keep following Jesus. Keep staying in his presence. Keep finding Jesus. Keep exposing yourself to the light. That's why every time you come to church on Sunday, here's what I pray and believe for you is you'll just get a little bit more. You just get a little bit more. And that's why you need to keep coming. That's why you need to keep opening your heart to the presence of God. And don't let anybody at this church or anywhere else ever stop you and say, dang, you still got some tent in there. You still got some Simon in there. You just hold on right there. I'm Simon Peter. If you think this is bad, you should have seen me last year. I'm just going to keep getting under the spout of grace and mercy and forgiveness that flows from the throne of grace. And so at the bridge, we like to encourage people, man, you ought to come to LTS in June. And people are like, why should I come to LTS in June? And I just want to say, it's kind of like this. It's just like, it's a little overflow. I just want to tell you something else. Sometimes in life you can be doing this really well. You can go through a season of life and you're like, man, praise God, I'm doing good. Have you ever felt like, man, I am becoming who God called me to be? And then you just run into somebody and they're like, here, hold on, I got something for you. You're like, what in the world just happened? But here's what I want to say to you. The most important thing of your life is that you develop a consistent pattern of finding a way to get under the grace and the presence of Jesus. People may pour junk in your life, but if you just keep on receiving and you just keep on, you just got to stay under there until all of that junk gets washed out. And I might run out of gallons of water, but Jesus ain't gonna run out of grace. Jesus ain't gonna run out of mercy. Jesus is not gonna run out of power. So sometimes you feel like, man, I don't really know if this is making a difference in my life, but if you just stay under the grace of Jesus, and right now, I can't tell because this thing is surrounded by all the after effects. But sometimes, if you just get it in new light, and here's the beautiful thing, you can pour something different into your children coming after you than what was poured into you. You can say, hey, I've got a cup that was poured into me. I'm gonna give you something better than I received. And here's what I'm believing at the Bridge Church. It's one of the things I believe God's saying to us, is that we're gonna become a church who knows how to plan, pray, and exist for generational. So we're gonna start believing God to be doing great things. So we're gonna take kids and put them right here and fill them up. I think I'm almost out of water. Don't have enough water up here. But I'm gonna fill this up and let it overflow. And then we're gonna pour that from generation to generation. Here's what I wanna tell you. I wanna encourage you right now. Maybe you're online, maybe you're right here. Sometimes you feel like the little things don't matter. Sometimes it can easily feel like I don't even know what difference this makes. And so almost every Sunday, I say to us at the end of my message, let's just take a moment and open our hearts. Let's take a moment and lift our hands. You know the reason I do that is because I believe every drop of grace matters. Every drop of grace makes a difference. And so you might say, man, I didn't even get anything out of that message. I don't even feel anything going on. But what you want to do is you want to say, by faith right now, Lord, I'm receiving more of your grace poured into my heart. I'm going to leave more like Peter than I came, more like who I was called to be.